Chapter 34. He opened his eyes to stare at the white ceiling above his bed. He turned his head and knew instantly that he was somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere else than where he should have been. "Damianos?" he yelled at the top of his lungs, suddenly realizing he was alone in what looked like another hospital room. "Damianos!" he shouted again, while trying to sit up, but could only raise his aching head off the pillow. The rest of his body felt as if he had hit a brick wall at full throttle. His limbs were heavy, sore, and irresponsive. "What's going on here? Where am I?" "Sir, please calm down. You're going to wake everyone," the nurse said, entering his room. "Where am I?" Dan repeated. "Why am I here?" "You're in the hospital, sir, and you've fallen from a great height, but the doctor will be talking to you shortly. And where's Damianos?" "Damianos, sir? Is that a friend of yours?" "Don't play with me, miss. Where is he?" "I'm sorry, sir. I don't know any Damianos, and I think you should be resting now." "I don't want to be resting. I want to get out of here, and if you would stop with this sir bit, I'd appreciate it." Dan tried getting up again. The nurse watched him. "You'll probably be able to get out of bed in a couple of days, but for now, you need to calm down." Getting frustrated, Dan threw a rueful glance at the woman and took a deep breath. "My name is—" He stared. "My name is—" He could not remember who he was. "Is Damianos your name, sir?" the nurse ventured. "No, that's not my name. And how come you don't know who I am?" Dan snapped, getting annoyed. The only thing he could remember was the name Damianos, and seeing him, or some man responding to that name, dressed in old shepherd's clothes. The rest was all a blur. "You had no identification on you when we found you. That's why we couldn't record your name." "And where did you find me?" "In a forest clearing, sir. You probably had fallen from a tree." "Fallen from a tree? Are you kidding me? I don't climb trees, at least not that I can remember." "Okay, why don't you try and get some rest now? Maybe you'll remember a little more after you've had some sleep." When Malou reached Pahokee and exited the picture, she was taken aback to find herself alone. Dan wasn't at her side. Dan, where are you?" she hollered, as if Dan should have heard her call and was somewhere in earshot, yet she couldn't see him. "Come on, this isn't funny." She spun on her heels and looked around her, and even threw a glance upward at the hotel window, pleading inwardly for Dan to appear and wave to her. Tears purling at the rim of her eyes, she returned her gaze to the picture. Then, as she was bending down to touch it, the old Indian, who had been watching her while he continued carving the little dream-catcher amulets, grabbed her wrist and brought her back up to face him. "Mrs. Politano, you are the one who has made it back." "But he was right beside me. How is that possible?" Malou shook her wrist off the old man's grip. "Why didn't he come back? Where is he?" She peered into the aging eyes. "Just tell me, please." "Did you hold hands?" "What?" She frowned. "What do you mean?"
"Asking if you and your husband held hands when you were ready to come back."
"Why, no, we didn't. Dan had his arm in a sling." "Oh my God," Malou shouted, putting her hand to her mouth. "You mean he's lost? He's gone somewhere else?"
"Yes, Mrs. Politano. You and your husband have been separated."
"Well, what does that mean? Will he find his way back?"
"I doubt it. He would have found another portal and enter another life by mistake."
Malou had a hard time with this. "What am I supposed to do now? How am I supposed to explain this to our kids?"
"Why not tell them the truth?"
Malou stared again. "But they'll never believe me. They'll think... Or I don't know what they'll think." She shook her head and began sobbing in earnest at the realization that her husband may be lost forever. "Good morning, sir," the doctor said, entering Dan's hospital room the next day. "I'm Dr. Ben Carson. How are you feeling?" Dan looked up. Dr. Carson was a sturdy and muscle-bound Afro-American man. His gentle eyes, however, reflected kindness and generosity. Well, I am aching all over and my head is killing me. Apart from that, I think I'm fine." "Well, that's good news." He paused. "But now the bad news is that you don't remember your name, right?" "I only remember the name of a man I see in some sort of flashback. Always the same old man dressed like a shepherd." "Yes, Dr. Nicky mentioned something about that. What's the guy's name again?" "Damianos, that's all I can tell you." Dan turned his head not to look at the doctor. He felt ashamed somehow, not knowing why he was there, in this bed, or what happened to him was one thing, but not even remembering his own name was something else entirely. "Yes," Dr. Carson said pensively. "Do you know what Damianos means?" "I vaguely remember something about it, yes. Isn't that the Greek name for tamer, or something like that?" "Ah, yes, and very good of you to remember." "Why is that good?" Dan asked, fixing his gaze on the man towering over him. "That's good because it means that you have long-term memory, and that only your short-term recall has been affected by the concussion." "I have a splitting headache. Is that the concussion too?" Yes, and your memory will probably come back to you bit by bit in a few days, but that's hard to say. Breaking the short silence between them, Dan then asked, "Could you tell me where this place is and what day this is?" Dr. Carson smiled. "You're at the Lower Keys Medical Center, and today is the 1st of November, 1988. "Thanks," Dan said. "That doesn't help much, but it's good to know." He looked up. "How old do you figure I am, Doc?" Distraught, Malou couldn't begin to think what to do. She shook her head in despair and then remembered the little church down the street. Without a further word to the old Seminole, she turned on her heels and walked down Main Street in the direction of St. Mary's Church. "God, please help me," she mumbled as she arrived in front of the chapel and looked up at the golden cross shining above the frontispiece. The open doors were welcoming somehow. She went in, dipped her fingers in the holy water, genuflected in the aisle facing the altar, crossed herself and went to sit on the nearest pew. Bowing her head and then kneeling on the cushion in front of her, she began praying. When she came out of the church, half an hour later, she knew what to do. She had always trusted in God's counsel, and today, or in the days to come, that attitude wouldn't change. As she got back to their car, she slid behind the wheel, and suddenly her attention was attracted by the cat, still lying on the windowsill beside the old Indian. She stared at it for a moment and whispered under her breath, "I'll see you again, Damianos. Of that you can be sure." Within a couple of days, as expected, Dan began to sit up in bed and was able to walk around a little. He felt weak, but at least his headache had gone. The other thing he noticed was he felt and looked younger than he remembered. As Dr. Carson had said, he was in his early 20s. "That's nice to feel young and healthy," he groaned, looking at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. "But not to know who you are or how old you really are is a bother." As he came out of the shower, he noticed that someone was sitting in the visitor's seat beside his bed, dressed in a dark blue suit and a white shirt, emphasizing her ample bosom, her hair pinned in a chignon at the nape of her neck. She looked somehow familiar, but Dan couldn't trust his instincts at this point. He probably never met the woman and was imagining things. Yet maybe, just maybe, she knows me, he thought. "Ah, good morning, sir," the woman said, getting up as Dan came across the room to regain his bed. "I am Mrs. Stevens from the Key West Social Services." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Stevens," Dan replied, sliding under the covers. "But you excuse me if I can't return the favour and give you my name. I don't know who I am, sorry." "That's all right, Mr. Damianos." "That's not my name," Dan erupted. "I just saw a guy named Damianos in my dream, that's all. I'm quite sure I'm not him." "That's all right," Mrs. Stevens repeated, plopping her behind in the seat again. "If you don't wish to be called by that name, as temporary as it may be, could you tell me what I should call you then?" "Listen, Mrs. Stevens, I don't care what name you put in your report, as long as I am able to let you know who I am as soon as I remember myself." "All right then, I shall leave it as Damianos for now, since the doctor tells me it won't be long until you regain your memory." She paused to write something in a notebook. "Since you have no recollection of your name, you might not remember where you live either, is that correct?" Sensing this middle-aged, tinted hair and brown-eyed woman was all business, Dan decided to play ball and get rid of her as soon as he possibly could. "Okay, you're right, I don't remember who I am or where I live, so what's the problem?" "The problem is, Mr. Damianos, that when you're going to be discharged, we'll need to house you somewhere." "House me somewhere?" Dan queried, eyes wide with realization. "You mean like a safe house or something?" "No, Mr. Damianos." "Stop with the Mr. Damianos bit, will you?" Dan cut in rudely. Mrs. Stevens shifted in her seat uncomfortably. "Well, sir, it won't be a safe house because you're in no need of a rehab." "That's good to know." "Yes, but you'll be given the name of a couple of shelter houses when you leave this hospital." "Shelters? You mean like homeless housing?" Dan was stunned. Yes, sir. That's the best we can offer, you see." "All I see, Mrs. Stevens, is that you're sending me down the street to live in a shelter just because I am a non-entity to you and your social services." By this time, Dan was beyond watching his manners. "Why don't you get the hell out of here and just leave me a number where I can call you when I finally remember who I am, okay?" 2 days later, and since he hadn't been able to remember his name or where he lived, and obviously had no insurance to cover his hospital bill, Dan was discharged and given the address of a nearby shelter. Dr. Carson had asked that he come back in a week or so for a checkup. When he arrived at the place, he entered the large house, pushing the door timidly, and was soon welcomed begrudgingly by an old fellow who seemed to have been sitting in the same chair, behind the same desk and wearing the same tattered clothes for at least the past 20 years. He looked up and saw a sign stating that Mr. Harrison was on duty today. Dan wondered if there was ever going to be any other name printed on that piece of cardboard. Probably none. "Hi," Dan said, depositing a duffel bag filled with men's clothes that Mrs. Stevens had given him beside the counter. "I'm Mr. Damianos." Dan hated even the sound of that name. "Mrs. Stevens sent me here. You have a room for me?" The old guy looked up from doing the crosswords in today's paper. He peered above the rim of his glasses and handed Dan a card and a pen. "Fill this out as best you can, and read the rules at the back of the card. When you're done, I'll give you a key to a room that you'll share with another guy. Name's Gustavo. Not very talkative, but he'll keep his paws to himself." "You mean I've got to share a room with somebody else?" "Yep, unless you can pay for the penthouse suite," Mr. Harrison cackled, and when he saw that Dan didn't find his quipping funny, he went on, "It's either that, or if you'd like more company, I can put you on the main floor with our off-the-street regulars. Up to you." He shrugged. Dan glared at the guy for a moment before filling out the card. He knew he didn't belong in this place, but where else was there? After going to his room and getting his belongings safely locked away in the lockbox at the foot of his twin bed, Dan went out to visit the city. He couldn't recall ever being in Key West, but if he had, walking the streets of the downtown area might trigger some memory. The weather was pleasant and only a light breeze flew from the ocean. With the few coins he had left from buying a hamburger, he took a bus that would take him to the Key West Naval Base. For some odd reason, he wanted to see the Navy's latest aircraft carriers, if any were docked at the facility today. By the end of the day, Dan had walked several miles along the ocean and Navy facilities, and for the first time in days felt calm. However, his subconscious was not to be appeased that easily, for that night he woke up screaming, "Damienos! Damienos!"